There are places where a man may vanish and leave nothing behind. And then there are places where the sea itself returns what was never meant to be found. On a cold October morning, beneath the weathered pilings of Alderney Pier, a body was discovered, wedged between the timbers as though placed there by unseen hands. The local doctor called it an accident, a simple fall, a drowning in the dark. But Sherlock Holmes saw something else, because the sea does not lie, and this time it had been forced to. Chapter 1: The Discovery Beneath the Pier. It is a curious thing about the cases I have chronicled with my friend Sherlock Holmes, that the most sinister of them rarely begin with thunder. They begin, more often than not, with the small, ordinary sounds of a morning that has not yet realised what it contains. A gull crying, a bell on a buoy, the slap of grey water against wet timber. So it was on the 15th of October, 1891, when a telegram from the Channel Islands drew us from the comfort of Baker Street and set us upon the deck of an early ferry, bound for an island I had until that morning been unable to find upon my map. The telegram had come the evening before, brief and military in its economy. Body washed against pier this dawn. Local doctor calls it accident, circumstances peculiar, would value your eye. Bramwell, Inspector, Alderney. I knew the name at once. Inspector Reginald Bramwell had served with my old regiment in the Punjab, a thoughtful and honourable man whose career had carried him by some quiet administrative current to the smallest of His Majesty's outposts in the English Channel. I had remarked upon his appointment to Holmes the previous spring, and Holmes had looked up from his chemical apparatus, raised one brow, and said only, "Alderney. A man might commit a great deal upon Alderney, Watson, and never be observed at all." I had thought it one of his theatrical pronouncements. Now, watching the island rise out of the fog like the back of some sleeping grey beast, I found the remark less theatrical and rather more prophetic. Holmes stood at the rail beside me, his ulster collar turned high against the salt wind, his gaunt face set with that peculiar hawkish stillness that came upon him when a case had taken hold. He had spoken little since Weymouth. He had instead studied for the entirety of the crossing a folded sheet containing the tide tables for the Western Channel. "You expect a great deal from those figures, Holmes," I ventured. "I expect," he said, without lowering the paper, "that the sea will tell us, in due course, whether it has been asked to lie." The ferry struck the harbour wall with a soft shudder. Alderney revealed itself in pieces, a stone breakwater curving like a protective arm, a single road climbing to a huddle of slate roofs, a white lighthouse on the eastern point, and beyond all of this, the long wooden length of the commercial pier, where even at distance I could make out the shapes of perhaps 30 figures gathered in the attitude of those who do not wish to look at something, but cannot bring themselves to leave. Inspector Bramwell met us at the gangplank. The years had thickened him about the middle and silvered his moustache, but the steady soldier's eyes were unchanged. "Watson, it is a kindness, your coming, and Mr. Holmes, I am in your debt before you have set foot on the boards. The body lies as we found it. I have permitted no one to disturb it." "That," said Holmes, "is the first piece of intelligent police work I have heard of this morning. Lead on." We followed him along the harbour road. The fog was thinning by degrees, and through it I observed the small life of the island faltering and gathering itself toward the pier. Fishermen pausing at their nets, 2 women in shawls speaking in the low tones one reserves for funerals. Word on an island of 2,000 souls travels not by telegraph, but by the simpler instrument of a glance over a wall. The crowd parted for us in respectful silence. At its edge stood a narrow, wind-burnt man of perhaps 40 in a dock-worker's heavy coat, wringing a cap between his hands with such force that the wool of it had begun to lose its shape. "Mr. Bell," Bramwell said gently, "these gentlemen are from London. Tell them what you told me." Arthur Bell looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the sour breath of last night's drink lay upon him still, but his agitation seemed to me of a deeper sort than mere shock. "I come down at 5:30, sir, as I do most mornings, to check the cleats afore the day boats run. The tide were on the turn. I were walking the north side, and I saw him, sir, just there, wedged between the pilings as though some hand had placed him so." "You touched nothing?" Holmes asked. "Not a button, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Bell. You will remain on the pier." "I may have further questions." We descended a wooden ladder to the lower platform, where the pilings rose from the water like the legs of some ancient creature half submerged. The tide was out, and what it had laid bare was not pleasant to look upon. A man of middle years lay between two of the great barnacle-encrusted beams, his head turned toward the open sea, his arms half raised as though he had been arrested in the act of pushing the timbers apart. He was dressed in the clothes of a respectable London traveller, a dark woolen coat now black with sea water, a waistcoat of grey worsted, a tie still neatly knotted at the throat. His hat was gone. His hair, what I could see of it, was the colour of ash. "His name," said Bramwell, "is Edward Hale, of Bloomsbury. He arrived on the 2:15 ferry yesterday afternoon, and took a room at the Seagull Inn. Dr. Graves examined him at 6 this morning, and gives the time of death as approximately 4 o'clock. He believes the unfortunate gentleman walked off the pier in the dark, struck his head upon a piling, and drowned." Holmes did not reply. He had crouched at the very edge of the lower platform, perhaps 3 feet from the body, and become so still that for a long moment I thought he had not heard. The water lapped beneath the timbers. A gull cried somewhere above the breakwater. Holmes did not move. I have known my friend perhaps 8 years at the time of writing, and I have come to recognize this particular silence. It is not the silence of a man considering. It is the silence of a man whose mind has begun, behind the still grey eyes, to move very fast indeed. He remained so for fully 3 minutes. Then he rose, and I observed that he had not even troubled to draw out his magnifying glass. "Watson, would you give me your medical opinion?" I came forward and knelt at the body's side. I am not a man easily disturbed by death, but there was something in the arrangement of poor Hale that made the small hairs rise upon my forearms. "He has the stillness of a man arranged, Holmes," I said quietly, "and not of a man fallen." "Go on." "His arms. Observe how they are raised, but not flung. A drowning man, in his last moments, claws. He grasps at anything. There would be debris in the fingers, splinters under the nails. His hands are clean." I lifted the right hand. "Almost too clean, considering the night he is supposed to have spent in the tide. And there is no foam at the nostrils, Holmes, none. I have examined many drowning victims. There is always foam. Anything further?" I pressed gently at the limbs. "Rigour is well advanced, considerably more advanced than it ought to be in a man dead some 3 hours. I should put the time of death at not less than 9 hours past, perhaps closer to 10. Holmes inclined his head a fraction of an inch, and I knew that I had told him nothing he did not already know, but that he was pleased I had told him none the less. "Inspector, you will forgive me if I trouble the body a little further." "Of course, Mr. Holmes." He knelt then, and his hands moved over the dead man with the quick, deft impersonality of a tailor taking a measure. He turned back the lapel of the soaked coat. He drew from the breast pocket a leather wallet, a folded handkerchief, and a small object which he held for the briefest of moments cupped within his palm, before passing it to me without comment. It was a railway ticket, a second-class ticket from Waterloo to Weymouth, dated the previous day. I turned it over, frowning. "Holmes, it is dry." "Quite dry, Watson, as is the inner lining of the wallet, as is the handkerchief." "But the coat is sodden." "The coat is sodden, the contents of the inner pocket are not. I make no observation upon that fact at present. I merely ask you to remember it." And he took the ticket back from me and returned it carefully to where he had found it. He moved next to the head. With a gentleness I have rarely seen him exhibit toward the living, he turned the dead man's skull a degree to the left and parted the wet hair behind the right ear. I leaned close. There was a wound there, a single wound, perhaps 1.25 inches in length, the skin split cleanly to the bone. There was no surrounding bruise of any breadth, no spreading contusion such as one would expect from a fall against a piling. This was a precise, contained injury, struck with a rounded instrument upon a particular point of the skull just behind and below the ear. "It is the mastoid process, Holmes," I said slowly. "A blow there, struck with sufficient force, would produce death almost instantly," Holmes finished. "Yes, Watson, almost instantly, and with very little external bleeding. A curious sort of injury for a drowning man to have collected on his way down." He rose to his feet and dusted the salt from his trouser knees. He had not, I noticed, examined the man's other pockets. He had not measured the angle of the body against the pilings. He had looked, and that was apparently sufficient. "One last thing," he murmured, and bent once more and lifted from the dead man's waistcoat a heavy silver pocket watch upon a steel chain. He pressed the catch. The case sprang open. The hands had stopped. They stood at 23 minutes past 9. Holmes looked at the dial for a long moment. Then he closed the case with a soft click and replaced the watch in the pocket from which he had taken it. "Inspector, the doctor who certified the death. I should very much like to make his acquaintance." "Dr. Graves, sir. Dr. Lionel Graves. He has practised on the island these 11 years. I have already sent for him." 11 years, Holmes repeated, very softly, as though the figure pleased him in some small private way. "Well, we shall be glad of his expertise." We climbed back to the upper boards of the pier. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, it had grown. I caught a glimpse of a tall woman in mourning black standing apart from the others at the landward end, her face turned away, and of Bell, still wringing his ruined cap, and of a thick-set, weather-beaten man in a dark blue jersey leaning against a bollard, watching us not with grief or curiosity, but with something that, for a moment, I should have called calculation. Holmes saw none of them, or if he saw them, he did not acknowledge it. He walked to the seaward edge of the pier, set his hands upon the rail, and looked out across the grey water. I came to stand beside him. The fog was almost gone now. A pale sun was beginning to silver the water. "He was killed before the water touched him," I said quietly. "Was he not?" "Many hours before, Watson." "And the watch, 23 minutes past 9. Tells us, perhaps, exactly when, or tells us what someone wishes us to think it tells us. We shall not yet decide which." He was silent a moment. "Watson, look at the pilings. Look at the line of the barnacles upon them, do you see?" "I see only barnacles, Holmes. You see the high water mark. You see where the sea has stood and where it has not. And you see, although you do not yet recognise that you see it, the place at which our Mr. Hale was wedged, a place which, by my calculation, the sea did not reach during the hours in which he is alleged to have drowned." He turned from the rail. His grey eyes had taken on the particular cold brightness that I had come, and over our long association, to find somewhat alarming. "Watson, the sea is being asked to tell a lie, and the sea is the most honest witness that has ever stood in any court. It does not lie willingly. A man has compelled it to." He drew his ulster about him and turned back toward the harbour road, where a small, dignified figure in a black coat had appeared at the head of the pier, and was making his way toward us with the unhurried confidence of one who has been called and knows that he will be welcomed. "And here," said Holmes, in a voice so low that only I could hear him, "comes the doctor." Chapter 2. A Case Too Simple. He was a small man, Dr. Lionel Graves, but small in the manner of certain very capable men whose authority owes nothing to their stature. He carried himself with unhurried gravity, as though the air about him were of a slightly heavier quality than the air the rest of us breathed. His hair was silver, brushed neatly back from a high, pale forehead. His coat was black and very well kept. He carried a black leather bag in his left hand, and in the buttonhole of his lapel there was a small white flower, evidently cut from his own garden before he had answered the inspector's summons. He came along the boards of the pier with the calm of a man who has been called to many such mornings. When he reached us, He set down his bag, removed his hat, and inclined his head, not the bow of a tradesman, not the nod of an equal, but something carefully calibrated between. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the inspector has spoken of you. I am Lionel Graves. I am at your disposal." "Doctor," said Holmes, returning the inclination with one of his own, "we are obliged." "It is a sad business." Graves' voice was low, educated, and unhurried. "I knew Mr. Hale not at all. I was called from my bed at 5:30. By 6 I had completed my preliminary examination. I have left my written report with the inspector. But if there is anything you wish to ask of me directly, I am of course entirely at your service." "You are very kind. I have only one question at present." "Pray ask it, sir." "When precisely," said Holmes, "did death occur?" The doctor did not pause. There was no flicker of consideration, no glance toward Bramwell, no small confirming frown. He answered as a man answers a familiar question of arithmetic. "Approximately 4 in the morning." "Approximately." "To within half an hour either side. The condition of the body, the temperature of the limbs, the degree of immersion, they are all consistent with a death some 2 hours before discovery. It is not an exact science, Mr. Holmes, as you are doubtless aware, but 4 o'clock is my professional estimate." Holmes did not answer for a moment. He stood looking at the doctor with an expression of pleasant, almost vacant attention, the expression he wore when he was committing something carefully to memory. I have learned, over the years, to mistrust that expression in him as one would mistrust the stillness of a cat at a mouse hole. To my eye, there was the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth, no more than a movement of perhaps a 32nd of an inch. Graves did not see it. "Thank you, Doctor," Holmes said at last. "That is most helpful." "And the cause?" Bramwell put in, with the air of a man who wishes to be helpful and is unsure whether he is being so. "Drowning, in my professional view, complicated by an ante-mortem injury to the head, sustained, in all likelihood, by a fall against a piling during the descent. The two together would have rendered the gentleman insensible within seconds. He would not have suffered." "He would not have suffered," Holmes repeated softly. How merciful. If Graves heard any irony in the remark, he gave no sign of it. He merely inclined his head a second time and asked whether we wished him to accompany the body to the mortuary. "If you would be so good," said Holmes. "Dr. Watson and I shall join you there directly. I should be grateful for the opportunity to examine the gentleman once more under proper light, and with the benefit of your opinion at my elbow." "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Of course." He bent to retrieve his bag. As he straightened, the motion caused his right hand to pass within perhaps a foot of my own. I noticed then, quite by chance, that the side of his thumb bore a small dark stain, not the rust brown of dried blood, but the deep, faintly bluish black of good writing ink, of the sort one acquires from long handling of the pen. A working stain, the kind any conscientious country doctor might wear without thinking, and I remarked upon it almost warmly as we turned to follow him along the pier. "You are evidently a man of paperwork, Doctor." He glanced at his thumb. He smiled. It was a small, rueful, gentlemanly smile. "The plague of our profession, Dr. Watson. Death certificates, birth certificates, reports for the parish, letters to the mainland. I sometimes feel I write more than I physic." "Ah," I said. "We are brothers in that, then." "Just so." He laughed softly and walked on. Holmes, beside me, said nothing at all. The mortuary at Alderney was not, properly speaking, a mortuary. It was the cold back room of the parish vestry, a low, whitewashed chamber with a single high window and a stone floor that sloped toward a drain in one corner. They laid Edward Hale upon a long deal table with the awkward tenderness that strong men extend toward the dead. The doctor lit 2 oil lamps and adjusted them so that the light fell evenly upon the body. "You will wish to begin, Mr. Holmes." "By all means." Holmes did not begin at the head, as a working physician would. He began at the feet, removing the dead man's boots with great care and turning them slowly in his hands. He examined the soles. He turned out one trouser cuff and then the other. He sniffed once, briefly, at the wool of the trousers. Then he set the boots aside and worked his way up the body in silence, while Graves stood at the head of the table with his hands folded before him, watching with the patient, faintly amused attention of an examiner observing a candidate of unfamiliar method. When Holmes reached the head wound, he stopped. "Doctor," he said, "you have observed this injury, of course." "Of course." "What instrument, in your professional view, produced it?" "A piling, Mr. Holmes, the under edge of one of the timber supports. There are several with iron banding at their lower extremities. A man falling from the upper boards in darkness, and striking such a banding, would receive a lacerated wound, certainly, but not, I think, this wound. There is no surrounding contusion, Doctor. None whatever. A fall at speed against an iron edge would crush the surrounding tissue. This skin is split as though by a single contained impact, as though," and here Holmes glanced up, very briefly, and met the doctor's eye, "as though the instrument were rounded and applied with deliberate force at a chosen point." Graves considered this for the space of perhaps 2 seconds. "It is an interesting observation, Mr. Holmes. I confess I had attributed the absence of bruising to the prolonged immersion. The action of cold seawater upon recently injured tissue can flatten and pale a contusion to near invisibility. I have seen it many times in fishermen drawn from the harbour." "Have you indeed?" "I have. It is one of the small lessons of practising medicine on an island." "I am sure it is." Holmes said nothing further upon the matter. He completed his examination, washed his hands at the small enamel basin in the corner, and dried them upon a clean linen towel which the doctor produced for him. He thanked Graves with great courtesy. He thanked Bramwell. He suggested that Watson and he might walk back into the village and take some breakfast at the Seagull Inn, by which time, perhaps, the inspector would have had leisure to draw up a list of all those persons who had had any communication with the deceased between his arrival at the harbour the previous afternoon and the discovery of his body at dawn. "I shall have it ready for you within the hour, Mr. Holmes." "You are most efficient. Doctor, I am in your debt." "It is nothing, Mr. Holmes. It is nothing." We left them at the vestry door. Outside, the sun was up properly now, and the harbour had taken on the cold pale gold of an October morning at sea. We walked in silence as far as the corner of the harbour road, where Holmes paused, drew out his pipe, and began with great deliberation to fill it. "Holmes," I said, "do you doubt the doctor?" He struck a match. He drew once upon the pipe. He shook out the match with a small, considered motion, and dropped it into the gutter. "I doubt Watson, the ease with which everyone believes him. He seemed to me a thoroughly creditable man. He seemed so to me also. That is precisely what I find remarkable. And his explanation of the wound, the action of cold water upon the bruising, is medically defensible. It is even, in a certain class of case, true. It is not true in this case. But it is the answer of a man who has thought about the question before being asked it. I considered this. You believe he was prepared? I believe, Watson, that we have been received this morning by a gentleman who has already rehearsed his lines. Whether he has rehearsed them out of innocent professional habit, or out of something less innocent, I shall not yet say. But I observe, and I ask you to observe with me, that we have met a doctor who answered the question of time of death without consulting his memory, who explained the absence of bruising without consulting his books, and who attended very closely throughout the examination, not to the body but to me. He drew once more upon his pipe and looked out across the small grey harbour, where the morning ferry was making ready to depart for the mainland. 11 years upon this island, Watson, he said. 11 years of being the one man whom no one would think to question. It is a very long apprenticeship in a very particular art. And he turned, and we walked together up the road toward the Seagull Inn, where the smoke of breakfast was beginning to rise from the chimney into a sky now almost entirely free of fog. Chapter 3. The Silent Island. There are places in the British Isles which a man may visit 100 times and never feel that he has properly arrived, and there are others which take possession of him within a single morning. Alderney, I came to understand that day, belongs to the second sort. It is a small island, perhaps 3.5 miles in length, scarcely 1.5 miles across, and upon it there live some 2,000 souls, every one of whom, by the second hour of one's residence, appears to know that you have come, why you have come, and what hour of the previous evening you took your last meal. There is no privacy upon Alderney. There is only the polite illusion of it, maintained by mutual agreement among neighbours who could, if they chose, recite each other's accounts to the shilling. Holmes and I took our breakfast at the Seagull Inn, a low, whitewashed house upon the harbour road whose front parlour looked directly out upon the masts of the fishing boats. The landlord, a stout and watchful man named Carrick, served us himself, and lingered with the air of one who is willing to be questioned without wishing to seem so. "You knew the gentleman, I take it," said Holmes, pouring his tea. "As much as one knows a guest of 2 nights, sir. He arrived on the afternoon ferry, took the back room, asked for a bath drawn, took his supper alone in the parlour at 7. His manner? Quiet, sir. Sad, I should say. Not the manner of a gentleman come for pleasure. He had the look of a man with business in his pocket, and the business not a happy one." "Did he speak with anyone?" "Not in this house, sir. He went out at 4:30, that I know, for I was setting the lamps. Returned for his supper. Went out again at 8 in the evening. I did not see him return." Holmes set down his cup. "At 8, you say?" "8, sir. Oh, the clock on the mantel had just struck." "And he carried something with him?" "A leather satchel, sir, same as he had brought from the mainland." "Thank you, Mr. Carrick. You are an admirable witness." The landlord coloured a little under the praise and withdrew. Holmes drew out his pipe, but did not fill it. He sat for some moments turning the bowl of it in his fingers and looking out at the harbour. "Out at 4:30, Watson. Returned for supper. Out again at 8 with the satchel. He went somewhere upon this island between 4 and 7, and somewhere again after 8, and at neither hour did he come home. 2 visits. 2 visits to 2 different persons, in all probability. The first prepared him, the second killed him. He set the pipe aside. Come, we have a village to walk. We walked it. The single road climbed from the harbour past the church, past the small grey schoolhouse, past a row of fishermen's cottages with nets drying upon the seaward walls, and on toward the open headland where the lighthouse stood. The wind off the channel was thin and cold and carried the salt smell of the rocks below. We paused first at the harbour master's office, where Holmes confirmed for himself the time of the previous afternoon's mainland ferry, 2:15 as Bramwell had told us, and noted the names of those who had disembarked from it. Edward Hale was among only 4 passengers. He had crossed with a crate of medical supplies consigned to the parish dispensary, 2 crates of nails for the chandler, and a single sealed letter for the postmistress, which she had since delivered. "Medical supplies," said Holmes very quietly, as we stepped back into the road. "Consigned to whom?" "To the parish dispensary, Mr. Holmes," said the harbour master's clerk, consulting his book. "Care of Dr. Graves." Holmes nodded once. He said nothing further upon the subject, but I observed that he stood a moment longer in the doorway than was strictly necessary, and that his eyes had taken on a thoughtful, narrow cast. We walked on. Captain Elias Moore was at his boat, as we had been told he would be. The Marianne was a stout, single-masted vessel of perhaps 30 feet, moored at the inner end of the harbour, and Moore was upon her foredeck with a bucket of caulking tar at his feet and a flat wooden paddle in his hand. He was a thick-set man of perhaps 55, with a weathered, deeply lined face and grey eyes that did not lift to meet ours as we approached. "Captain Moore," said Holmes pleasantly, "a word, if you would." Moore did not pause in his work. The paddle moved, slow and deliberate, along a seam of the deck. "I'm at my work, sir." "So, I observe. May I ask when you began it?" "Yesterday morning, 7:30, as any man might tell you." "And the bollard yonder, the one at the corner of the slip, You retard it also." For the first time the grey eyes lifted. Moore looked at Holmes for a long moment without expression. "Aye, yesterday morning." "Thank you, Captain. That is helpful." "Helpful to what, sir?" "To the truth. Good day to you." We walked on. When we were perhaps 50 yards beyond the boat, I asked Holmes what use he had made of so brief an interview, and he answered without slowing his stride. "I have established, Watson, that any man who sat upon the bollard at the corner of the slip yesterday afternoon would have risen with tar upon his coat, and I observed, when I knelt beside our Mr. Hale at dawn, a small dark smudge precisely upon the seat of his trousers. The captain has explained the smudge for us very obligingly, without yet knowing that he has done so." "Then Moore is innocent." "Of placing the smudge, yes. Of other matters, we shall see." We came at length to the lighthouse. It stood at the eastern point of the island upon a low platform of weathered stone, and beside it there was a small white cottage with a green door and a row of sea pinks growing in tubs beneath the windows. The keeper himself was at the lamp above. His wife answered our knock, a thin, brisk, observant woman of perhaps 40, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and flour upon her hands. "Mrs. Penrose," said Holmes, removing his hat, "forgive the intrusion. We are inquiring upon a matter of police business. May we trouble you for a moment?" "You're the London gentleman, then." Come in. I've a kettle on." She seated us in a small bright parlour, where a clock ticked steadily upon the mantel, and a yellow cat slept in the window. She poured us tea. She answered Holmes' questions with the cheerful directness of a woman who has had little to talk of in a fortnight, and was not minded to waste an opportunity. She had not seen Mr. Hale. She had not been to the village the previous day. She had been at home all evening with her sewing. "And from this window, Mrs. Penrose," said Holmes, indicating it with a small movement of his hand, "one has, I think, a very fine view of the village by night." "Oh, very fine, sir. The lights below, the boats at their moorings. I can see the doctor's surgery from here, and the schoolhouse, and the back of the inn. My husband says I am as good as a second lighthouse sitting up at this window." "The doctor's surgery?" "Yes, sir. The lamp in the back room. He works late, the doctor. He is much respected for it." "And last night?" "Last night, sir." She paused, frowning a little, as though the question had touched some small private observation she had not thought to mention. "Last night the lamp burned later than usual. Past 1 in the morning, sir, by my own clock there. I remarked upon it to my husband when he came down at the change of the watch. 'The doctor's at his books again,' I said. 'That man will work himself into his grave.' 'Past 1, Holmes repeated with the gentlest possible inflection. "You are quite certain?" "Quite certain, sir. The clock had struck the quarter." "You have a very precise eye, Mrs. Penrose." "One does, sir, in a house like this." We did not stay much longer. Holmes thanked her with a warmth I rarely saw him expend, complimented the cat, admired the sea pinks, and we took our leave. The door closed behind us. The wind off the channel lifted the skirts of our coats. We walked perhaps 20 paces in silence along the cliff path before Holmes spoke. "Watson, the doctor told us this morning that he was called from his bed at 5:30. "He did." "From his bed, implying of course that he had been in it some considerable time. A man who has been working at his books until past 1 in the morning does not present himself, 4 hours later, as a man drawn from sleep. He might. Some men sleep little. Some men do. I shall reserve the question." But his voice had taken on a particular quietness which I had learned, in our years together, to recognize as the silence of a man placing a small bright stone upon a scale he had begun to keep. We walked on along the cliff. The sea opened beneath us, grey and slow and immense, breaking white upon the rocks 200 feet below. A pair of gulls hung motionless upon the wind. Holmes paused at the cliff's edge and looked out across the water toward the invisible coast of France. "On an island this small, Watson," he said at length, "a man cannot kill without his neighbour's hearing. The question is only which neighbour is listening, and whether she knows that she has heard. He turned and we walked back toward the village in silence. The lighthouse cottage receded behind us. Below, in the harbour, the Marianne lay quiet at her mooring, and beyond her, on the harbour road, I could just make out the small, dignified figure of Dr. Graves, returning unhurriedly from the vestry to his surgery, his black bag swinging at his side. Chapter 4. The Man Who Shouldn't Be There. Holmes dispatched his telegram from the postmistress's small wooden counter shortly after 11 that morning. He composed it standing, in the cramped manner of a man unwilling to occupy a chair he did not need, and he wrote it in his own hand upon the form provided. He addressed it to a name in Threadneedle Street which I did not recognise, but which the postmistress evidently did, for she glanced up at him once, pursed her lips, and counted the words twice over before accepting his coin. "How long, ma'am, for a reply?" 2 hours, sir. Perhaps 3. The wire is good today. Excellent. We shall return. He paused at the door. "One further question, Mrs. Trevithick. I trust I have your name correctly. Did Mr. Hale, the gentleman who came over on yesterday's 2:15, send any telegram from this office?" "None, sir." "Did he receive one?" The postmistress hesitated. She glanced at the heavy ledger upon the counter, then at Holmes, then back at the ledger. "He did, sir. From London. It came in upon the morning wire, about 10:15. I sent the boy up to the Seagull with it directly." "Was its content noted?" "It is not my custom, sir, to note the content of telegrams which are not addressed to the parish." "Of course not. Forgive me. May I trouble you only for the sender?" She consulted the ledger. Her finger found a line and stopped. "A firm of solicitors, sir. Pemberton, Hayes and Cole, Threadneedle Street. Same address as your own." Holmes's face did not change. He thanked her with great politeness and stepped out into the road. "The same firm, Watson," he said quietly. "The same firm that sent him over." Whatever business Edward Hale was conducting upon this island, his employers in London were anxious enough to wire him about it within hours of his arrival, and they have, by the by, very fortunately given us the precise question to put to them in our own telegram. We made our way back to the Seagull Inn. Carrick, the landlord, was in his small private parlour, entering figures into a ledger of his own, and looked up with a guarded readiness as we entered. "Mr. Carrick," said Holmes, "we should be obliged if you would unlock the late Mr. Hale's room and permit Dr. Watson and myself to make a search of his effects. The inspector, I believe, has already given his consent." "He has, sir. 1/2 an hour past. He left a note to that effect." "Then if you will be so good." The room was a small, clean one at the back of the house, with a single window looking out upon a yard of cobbles and a chestnut tree gone half bare with the season. The bed was made. A traveller's case stood open upon the floor, its few contents folded neatly within. A silver-backed hairbrush lay upon the washstand. The whole had the chastening tidiness of a man who has lived alone and learned the small disciplines of doing so. Holmes did not begin with the case. He began, as he had begun at the body, with the floor. He went first to the washstand, then to the bed, then knelt and looked beneath it. He withdrew a leather satchel, the same satchel, I had no doubt, that Carrick had described to us at breakfast. It was empty. Holmes turned it over in his hands. He examined the brass clasp. He drew his finger along the inner lining and held it up to the light. Then he set the satchel upon the bed and resumed his examination of the floor beneath it. A moment later he made a small sound, not of triumph but of confirmation, the sound of a man who has found the thing he had hoped not to find. He drew out, between his thumb and forefinger, a small fragment of paper. It was scarcely larger than a postage stamp. Its edges were charred to a fine black lace. Most of it had been consumed. What remained was the upper right corner of what had been, by the texture of the paper and the ruled blue lines visible upon it, a sheet from a ledger or accountant's book. He laid it upon the bed beside the satchel. He bent over it. I bent with him. There were 5 fragments of writing upon it, in a small, neat hand. 2 of them were figures, £412 and £28 10s, partial sums in old-fashioned bookkeeping pounds, shillings and pence. One was a date, 14th March 1887. One was the partial word estates, and one, at the very edge, was a name. Broken across the burned line, it read Vess L. 14 estates over. Holmes did not move for some seconds. Then he drew himself slowly upright. Watson, I see it, Holmes. Estates. And the figures. They are sums of money. They are sums of money over time, Watson. 14. The phrase is over 14. And the name... He did not finish the sentence. He turned the fragment over very gently with a fingernail. The reverse was blank. He took out his pocketbook and laid the scrap between two fresh leaves of it and closed the book. Holmes, I said. Vess L. It is a fragment only. It might be any number of names. Haves, Reeves, Travers. It might. Indeed it might. He was looking out of the small window at the chestnut tree in the yard, and his voice had become almost dreamy. But the L is interesting, Watson. Not many surnames bear an initial L on this island, and our victim, who was burning a document under cover of his own bedroom hearth, was burning it for a reason. He burned it himself. He must have. The fragment was beneath the bed, fallen from the grate by all evidence. The grate is cold now. There are flecks of black ash in the boards before it. He returned here between 4 and 8, Watson, and he sat in this room, and he burned a paper which he had not the courage either to keep or to send to the mainland. He burned it, and he went out at 8, and he did not come back. Whatever was upon that paper, he died within 4 hours of destroying it. I confess that a small chill passed across my shoulders at this, for the room about us, with its quiet washstand and its silver-backed brush, took on for a moment the air of a cell whose former tenant had walked very deliberately to his own end. We searched the rest of the room. We found very little. A second-class return ticket, Weymouth to Waterloo, dated for the following Friday. A receipt from a Bloomsbury haberdasher. A small leather case of visiting cards. Edward Hale, Esquire, Bloomsbury. No profession given, no firm. He travelled light, Holmes observed, for a man on a long errand. Whatever he carried in this satchel, it was paper. And whatever it was, he meant to leave Alderney by Friday's ferry, having concluded the business it concerned. We returned downstairs. Holmes dispatched the boy to the harbour master, with a half-crown and instructions to bring word the instant the reply telegram arrived from London. He then turned to me with the brisk, decided manner that signalled the next movement of his thought. There is a person upon this island, Watson, whom Mr. Hale called upon at 4:30. We have not yet identified that person, but there is a small body of testimony available to us, and a single small piece of it I should very much like to test. Whom do you propose to call upon? The schoolmistress, a Miss Whitby, I am told. Her cottage stands not 300 yards from this inn. The inspector mentioned her name in passing this morning, when he listed the persons of any standing within the village. He mentioned her as a Bloomsbury woman by birth who came to Alderney some 3 years ago to take the parish school. Bloomsbury, I said. Bloomsbury, Watson. The same parish of London, by no remarkable coincidence, in which Mr. Edward Hale of Bloomsbury kept his lodgings. We found the cottage without difficulty. It stood at the end of a short lane, small and whitewashed, with a gate of weathered green wood and a single rosebush, long past flowering, leaning against the southern wall. Holmes knocked. There was a long silence. Then the door was opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was perhaps 29. She was tall, almost my own height, and her hair was dark and pulled back severely from a pale, fine-boned face. Her eyes were grey and intelligent and red-rimmed. She had been weeping not long ago, and had taken the trouble to wash her face, but not, I thought, to disguise the fact. She wore black, a high-necked plain black dress of the sort that women wear to funerals and to widowhoods. I've practised long enough as a physician to know the dress of mourning when I see it, and I knew, also, that the death of a London gentleman discovered at dawn upon the pier had not yet been published anywhere upon the island as a death of any consequence to a Bloomsbury schoolmistress, She had not waited to be told. "Miss Whitby," said Holmes very gently. "Yes." "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. May we trouble you for a few minutes of your time?" She looked at us. She did not move. After a moment she said in a low, perfectly steady voice, "I have not seen Mr. Hale in 3 years, Mr. Holmes. I do not know what assistance I can possibly be." "Miss Whitby," said Holmes, "I have not yet mentioned Mr. Hale." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It was a long 2 seconds. Then she stepped back from the door and held it open, and we went inside. Chapter 5. The First Cracks. It was 3:15 in the afternoon when Holmes announced, without preamble, that he proposed to examine the body a second time. We were in the parlour of the Seagull Inn. The first of his telegrams had been answered. A thin slip of paper lay on the table between us, and upon it, in the yard's economical hand, there stood a single line: Hale, Edward, Bloomsbury, forensic accountant, Marchant and Drew, solicitors, reputation unimpeachable. "Forensic accountant," I repeated, as I had suspected from the burned fragment. Not an investigator of crimes in the criminal sense, an investigator of accounts, a man hired by solicitors, by creditors, by heirs who suspect they have been cheated. A man who comes to small islands with a satchel of documents and a notebook full of figures and seeks out, very quietly, a single respectable gentleman whose books will not bear close examination. "Holmes, if this is right, Watson, our poor Mr. Hale came to Alderney not as a lover, not as a traveller, not as a man in flight, but as a hunter. The blackmail I had half suspected was not blackmail at all. It was an interview." He folded the telegram and placed it in his pocket. "Come, I wish to see him once more, now that I know what he was." We walked to the vestry. The afternoon had turned colder. A thin wind off the channel was driving fragments of cloud across the sun, and the small grey harbour lay empty, the Marianne still at her mooring, the day-boats not yet returned from their grounds. Doctor. Graves was not at the vestry. He was at his surgery, we were told, receiving patients. But Bramwell had left the key with the sexton, and we were admitted without difficulty. The body lay where we had left it. The 2 oil lamps stood extinguished at the head of the table. Holmes lit them both. He removed his ulster. He rolled his shirt-sleeves above the elbow with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for an hour's work. "Watson, I desire a second opinion upon this man. I want every observation that a medical officer of the British Army would make upon a corpse drawn from water. I want it offered without reference to Dr. Graves' report, and without reference to anything I have said to you this morning. Treat me as an ignorant policeman. Instruct me." "Very well." I took up one of the lamps and bent to the work. I began at the face. I examined the nostrils, the mouth, the throat. I depressed the chest and listened at the lips. I turned the head and examined the ears. I examined the hands, finger by finger, and the nails and the wrists. I lifted the coat at the cuffs and looked beneath them. I examined the ankles. I pressed at the abdomen. I stood back at last and spoke my findings to Holmes, as I would have spoken them to a coroner. There is no foam at the nostrils and none in the mouth. The throat, so far as I can see without a blade, shows no sign of water ingested. The chest, on compression, releases no fluid. A drowning victim's chest, even after hours upon a slab, will release seawater when pressed. This man's will not. His lungs are dry, Holmes. He did not breathe the sea. Go on. The pattern of salt upon the skin is consistent with 3, perhaps 4 hours of immersion. A body in the tide from, let us say, 9:30 in the evening until 5:30 in the morning would show far more extensive salt crystallization, particularly at the creases of the neck and the insides of the elbows, where seawater lingers and evaporates. These areas are barely marked. Excellent. Proceed. I lifted the dead man's left sleeve. I had not examined the wrists that morning. The hands had so distracted me, and the doctor's presence had hurried us. But I examined them now, carefully, at both the left and the right. There were marks, faint but unmistakable. a band of discoloration running the width of each wrist, perhaps half an inch broad, as though a rope or a leather strap had been drawn tight and held there for some considerable time. Holmes! Yes, Watson. He was bound. After death, the skin is not broken, there is no bleeding, but bound at the wrists for the purpose of moving him, of dragging him, Watson. Observe also the heels of his boots. Holmes lifted one. The leather of the heel was freshly scored. 2 faint parallel scratches, such as might be made by the boot being dragged, heel down across rough stone or wood, hauled post-mortem some considerable distance. I straightened. The oil lamp trembled slightly in my hand. I set it down upon the deal table beside the body. Then this is not an accident. It is not an accident, Watson. And the time of death is not 4 o'clock this morning. The time of death is what the dead man's watch tells us it is, and what your examination of the rigger this morning told us it was. 9 hours, you said, perhaps 10. 23 minutes past 9 of the previous evening. Rigor corroborates it. The dryness of his lungs corroborates it. The absence of salt corroborates it. The ligatures upon his wrists corroborate it. Every piece of the man's body, Watson, tells the same story. He was killed between the hours of 9 and 10 last night, somewhere indoors, by a single precise blow behind the ear. He was kept, for some hours, where his body lay undisturbed. He was then bound at the wrists and dragged to the pier, by a handcart, I should imagine, for the boot scratches are shallow and even. He was placed, not thrown, beneath the pilings at the turn of the tide, and at 5:30 this morning he was discovered by Mr. Arthur Bell, at whose unusual hour I shall have further words presently. He rolled down his sleeves. He drew on his ulster. His grey eyes in the lamplight had taken on that cold, still quality I had seen upon the pier at dawn. And the medical certificate, Watson, which gives the time of death as 4 o'clock, is a lie, a written lie, signed and witnessed by the physician of this parish. I stared at him. Holmes, you cannot mean... I mean only what the evidence means, Watson. I make no accusation yet. I observe a document. I observe that the document is false. I observe that the man who wrote it is a physician of 11 years' standing, beloved of the parish, whose lamp burned past 1 in the morning upon the night of the murder. I make no accusation. I ask only that you set these facts beside one another and consider whether they sit easily. They do not sit easily. They do not sit easily, no. We were interrupted then. The vestry door opened. Dr. Graves himself stood upon the threshold, his black bag in his hand, his silver hair catching the slant of afternoon light from the high window. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the sexton informed me you were here. I trust I do not intrude. Not at all, doctor. Pray, come in. Graves entered. His eyes travelled, with professional composure, over the body, over the lamps, over my sleeves rolled to the elbow, over the small notebook in Holmes's hand. If he saw anything that alarmed him, he gave no sign of it. His face wore that same mild, attentive, faintly interested expression with which he had received us upon the pier. You have concluded your examination? We have. And your findings are consistent with my report, I trust? Holmes was silent for the smallest measurable part of a second. Then he smiled. It was the smile he reserved, in my experience, for the moment immediately before a man walked off the edge of a cliff he had not known was there. They are remarkable findings, Doctor. I shall not trouble you with them at present. They require further verification, and I should not wish to trespass upon your own conclusions without the fullest evidence in hand. I hope you will forgive me. Of course, Mr. Holmes. Of course, in your own time. You are most generous. Not at all. The doctor inclined his head, that same precise, calibrated half-bow, and withdrew. The vestry door closed behind him with a soft finality. His footsteps receded along the flagstone passage. A gull cried, very faintly, from somewhere out over the harbour. Holmes stood for a long moment looking at the closed door. "Watson," he said at last, very softly. "You observed him?" "I observed him." "Did his face change? At any moment? At any word?" "It did not, Holmes. Not a muscle." "No, not a muscle." He drew in a long, slow breath. "A very remarkable man, Watson, a man who has stood at this moment upon the trap of his own scaffold, and felt it tremble beneath his feet, and not move so much as an eyelid. I have met perhaps 3 men in my career who could do such a thing. None of them died in their beds." He extinguished the lamps. He drew the sheet with his own hand over the face of Edward Hale, and as we stepped out into the pale October afternoon, and into the cold wind off the Channel and the small indifferent cries of the gulls, he turned to me with the grave, set expression of a man who has at last identified the shape of the thing he is hunting. "Watson," he said, "someone upon this island knew the sea. Someone knew medicine. Someone knew the precise hour of the tide and the precise location of a blow that would kill a man in silence. And that someone walks among the living here at this moment, greeting his neighbours, receiving his patients, and writing upon my dead man's certificate the false hour of 4 o'clock in the morning." "Who, Holmes?" "Someone, Watson," he said, "who knew the sea would cover for him." Chapter 6. The Web of Lies. We took Captain Moore first. He was still upon the Marianne at 5 o'clock. He sat upon the foredeck with a clay pipe between his teeth and a tin mug of black tea at his elbow, and he did not rise as we stepped onto the gangway. He merely turned his grey eyes upon us and waited. "Captain," said Holmes, with a pleasantness so light it was almost a caress. "A word of private business, if you would." "Step aboard, then." We stepped aboard. Holmes stood at the low rail with his hands clasped behind his back. "Captain Moore, I should like you to tell me where you were between the hours of 9 o'clock last night and 2 o'clock this morning." "I were at home." "Alone?" "Aye." "That is unfortunate." "Unfortunate for who, sir?" "For you, Captain, because the tar upon the bollard at the corner of the slip has, by the smallest accident, absolved you of being upon the pier at any hour after 6 o'clock yesterday evening, when you completed your day's work and went, as I have already established, to the Black Anchor for a pint. You were not at home, Captain. Let us not waste each other's time. You were elsewhere upon this island, in company, conducting business of a sort that you do not wish the customs officer of Weymouth to hear about." Moore took the pipe from his mouth very slowly. He did not answer. "I am not," said Holmes, still pleasantly, "the customs officer. Your brandy is safe with me. I wish only to know whom you were with, and whether any of them can speak for your whereabouts until the small hours of this morning." For a long moment Moore did not move. The grey eyes weighed Holmes as a man weighs a stranger across a card table. Then, with a small, defeated motion, he set the pipe down upon the deck beside him. "Tom Leverett, Willie Haynes, a third as shall be nameless. We were at the cave below Clank Point from 10 last night until 3 this morning, landing a consignment. The Leverett boy and Haynes will swear to it if they must. But, sir, if it comes to court—" "It will not come to court. Not upon my account." Holmes looked at him with something almost like approval. "Thank you, Captain. You are free to return to your caulking." We left him on his boat with his pipe cold beside him, and we walked back along the harbour road in the fading afternoon. Holmes made no comment for perhaps 100 yards. Then he said only, "One, Watson." "One what?" "One candle snuffed." "A man who could not have killed Edward Hale because he was engaged in smuggling French brandy at the precise hour of the murder. A poor sort of alibi for the pulpit, an adequate sort for our purposes." We came next to the cottage at the seaward end of the village road. Clara Whitby opened the door herself. She had changed out of the morning black. She wore a grey woolen dress now, and her hair was loose upon her shoulders. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. "Mr. Holmes," You have come back. May we trouble you for a quarter of an hour, Miss Whitby? I believe you have not yet told us all that you might." She stood aside without a word. We entered. She sat in the chair nearest the fire and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Miss Whitby," said Holmes, with a gentleness I have rarely heard from him, "I shall not trouble you with what is painful if you will tell me the truth. Mr. Hale visited you yesterday afternoon at 4:30. He stayed, I think, perhaps 40 minutes. He asked something of you, and you refused him. When he had gone, you burned a paper which he had left with you, in that grate at which you are presently looking. Is this so?" She did not lift her head. "It is so." "What did he ask of you?" "He asked—" She stopped. She pressed the back of one hand against her mouth. "He asked me to come with him, back to London. He said he had been a fool. He said the business which had brought him here was nearly finished, and when it was finished, he would be a man of means and could provide for me as he should have done before. He said he had not forgotten, had never forgotten—" She broke off. She did not cry. She was beyond crying. "And you refused." "I refused? Because, Mr. Holmes." She looked up at last. Her eyes were dry and very dark. "Because I lost a child upon his account 3 years ago, and I do not come back from that for the promises of a man in a hurry." Holmes inclined his head. He did not speak for perhaps 10 seconds. "The paper you burned," he said at last. "What was it?" "A poem. He had written it in his notebook, and torn the leaf out, and pressed it into my hand at the door. It was the same poem he had written for me 4 years ago in London, in his own hand. He had kept it. All this time, he had kept it." She was silent. "I burned it because I could not bear to keep it, and could not bear to throw it away." "Where did you go last night, Miss Whitby, after he had left?" "Nowhere? Sir, I was here. I graded the exercises of my Tuesday class. I went to my bed at 10 o'clock. I heard nothing until Mrs. Colston came to the door at 7 this morning with the news." "Thank you, Miss Whitby." Holmes rose. "I shall not trouble you further. You have my word that nothing you have told me will be spoken of beyond this room." She did not rise to see us out. We left her by the fire with her hands folded in her lap, and the grey afternoon light falling through the small window across her face. Outside in the road, Holmes said quietly, "2, Watson. She did not kill him." "She did not kill him." "You are certain?" "I am certain. A woman who has lost a child does not kill the man who gave it to her. She mourns him. She burns his poem. She lets him walk out of her door, and she never speaks his name again." He was silent a moment. "It is a pity. She would have made him a very fine wife. He was not worth her." We took Arthur Bell at his own cottage, near the dock, in the last of the afternoon light. His wife admitted us, a thin, pale woman still in her sick-bed shawl from the influenza she had shaken off only that week. Bell sat at the kitchen table with a mug of ale before him, and the look of a man who had been expecting us since morning. "Mr. Bell," said Holmes without sitting, "the lead sinkers in Mr. Hale's coat pockets were cast in a mould of your own making. I have compared them to the sinker I took from your tackle box an hour ago. The pattern is identical. You will now tell me, with great precision, when and how they left your possession." Bell went white beneath his weathering. "Sir, on my life, I never touched the man. I do not yet accuse you. Answer the question." "My shed, sir. My shed were broke into. 3 nights back. No, 4. 4 nights back. I come down of a morning and the bolt were off and the sinkers were short. 6 gone. I cursed it, and I thought no more. There's always a boy or 2 on this island will take what ain't tied down. Was anything else gone?" "A length of cord, sir. Perhaps 8 foot. A coil of light cord from off the bench." "Not the cord of the wrists, Watson," said Holmes, almost to himself. "The ligature was leather, a doctor's strap, no doubt. But the cord is for the sinkers. To weight the coat pockets at the bottom of the pleat." He turned back to Bell. Mr. Bell. Who has been inside your shed during the past week? Sir, only the usual. My boy, myself. No one else? No one, sir? No neighbour? No, sir. Think carefully, Mr. Bell. Has any gentleman of the village entered your home in the past 10 days? And then, and I shall remember it always, the small pause, the flicker across his face as the question reached him. Bell's eyes opened a little wider, and he said, Only the doctor, sir. Only Dr. Graves. He come up of a Tuesday night to see my missus. She were bad with the fever. He were here perhaps an hour. At what time of the evening? Late, sir. Nigh on 9, and he stayed till past 10. And your shed? Gives off the yard, sir. You can reach it from the back door. He'd have passed it going out. I'm sure he would, said Holmes with the very gentlest of smiles. He thanked Bell. He thanked Mrs. Bell. We stepped out into the yard. The shed stood 6 paces from the back door, its bolt hanging loose. We walked back toward the inn in the failing light. The harbour was grey now, the lamps beginning to be lit along the quay. I could contain myself no longer. Holmes, Bell is the killer. He must be. The sinkers. The early hour at the pier. He stole from the body and returned the sinkers to the coat out of some instinct of concealment. Bell did not kill him, Watson. But Bell is a dock thief. He rose at 5 this morning, not to patrol the cleats, but to move a quantity of stolen cargo, which we shall not trouble to inventory. When he came upon the body, he ran for the inspector rather than for his boat, which is the action of a frightened man, not a guilty one. His sinkers were taken from him 4 nights ago, and the man who took them stood for an hour in his kitchen 3 nights ago with a doctor's bag in his hand, and the opportunity of passing within 6 paces of an unbolted shed on his way out. I stopped in the road. Holmes? Yes, Watson. You speak as though... I speak as though nothing yet. I observe only that the sinkers did not walk themselves from Arthur Bell's shed into the coat pockets of Edward Hale. A hand carried them, a hand we have now accounted for in 3 separate particulars. He walked on. 3 candles, Watson. 3 suspects named and 3 suspects cleared. A murderer does not leave 4 doors open, he leaves 1. And he stands beside it, smiling, and invites us to walk through. I walked after him in silence. The lamps of the harbour grew clearer in the dusk. Somewhere, beyond the roofs of the village, the single window of a surgery would be burning yellow against the October night, and the man within would be receiving his last patient of the day with a small, composed, gentlemanly smile. Surely it's Bell, I heard myself say again, uncertainly, almost to myself. That, Watson, said Holmes without turning, is exactly what we are meant to think. Chapter 7. The Language of the Tides. Holmes did not come down to breakfast. I found his bed had been slept in, barely, and at one corner only, as though he had lain upon it without undressing. But the man himself was gone. His ulster was missing from the peg. His pipe was cold upon the washstand. A single sheet of paper lay upon the writing desk, covered in his rapid angular hand, with a series of figures I could not interpret, and at the bottom, underlined 3 times, 2 words. Placed, not washed. I took my breakfast alone. At 8:30 I asked Carrick whether he had seen Mr. Holmes that morning. He had. Mr. Holmes had departed the inn at first light, walking briskly in the direction of the harbour. I found him at 9:30 in the harbour-master's office, a low stone room at the foot of the pier smelling of rope and tar and old ledger paper, seated at a desk that was not his own, with the harbour-master's tide charts spread before him in a great fan of paper, and beside them a pocket compass, a 6-inch rule, and the sheet of figures I had seen upon his writing desk, now much enlarged with fresh calculations. He did not look up when I entered. He was drawing a line, a single slow pencil line, across the face of the chart, and his lips were moving silently, and upon his face there was the expression I have described elsewhere as that of a man who hears music no one else can hear. Holmes? 1 moment, Watson. I waited. The pencil completed its line. Holmes set it down. He sat back. He looked at the chart for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he spoke. "Watson, come here. Stand beside me. Look at this chart." I came and stood beside him. The chart showed the tidal movements for Alderney Harbour for the month of October, drawn in the careful hand of the harbour master's clerk, a series of curves, blue for high water and red for low, here with the hours of the day marked along the bottom and the depth in fathoms along the side. "Tell me what you see." "I see the tides, Holmes." "You see the tides? Good. Now look at the night of the 14th, the night of the murder. High water was at 23 minutes past 11. The tide began to fall at 11:30 and reached its lowest point at 17 minutes past 5, which is, as you will recall, approximately the hour at which Mr. Arthur Bell descended to the pier and found the body." "Yes." "Now, the body was wedged between the north pilings at a height of 4 feet above the low water line. I measured the height this morning at dawn while you slept, by lowering a weighted cord from the upper boards, 4 feet and 2 inches precisely. The barnacle line upon those pilings, the permanent high water mark, stands at 11 feet and 7 inches, meaning the body was placed at a point the high tide would have covered, but the falling tide would progressively reveal. A point which, on the night of the 14th, was last submerged at approximately midnight, and which emerged from the retreating water at approximately 2:15 in the morning." He turned to me. His grey eyes were very bright. "Do you see it, Watson? The body could not have been placed at that height while the water still covered it. The man who placed it would have needed to stand upon the lower platform, and the lower platform was under 2 feet of water until 1:20. But nor could the body have been placed much later than 2:30, and because the retreating tide would have left it visible to anyone on the harbour road by 3 o'clock, and the fog that night, as I have confirmed with Mrs. Penrose, did not thicken until 2:30. "Then the window?" "The window is narrow, extremely narrow, between approximately 1:20 and 2:30 in the morning. 70 minutes, no more. And within that window, a man transported a dead body from somewhere inland, along the harbour road, down the ladder to the lower platform, and wedged it between the pilings at a calculated height, all without being seen." He rose from the desk and crossed to the window that looked out upon the harbour. "This was not the work of a frightened man, Watson. This was not the work of a man who had killed in a moment of passion and was scrambling to conceal the evidence. Yes, this was the work of a man who sat down after the blow and calculated, who opened his tide almanac and read the figures for the night, who knew, because he had studied such things over many years of living upon this island, precisely when the water would fall and precisely when the fog would serve him. A man of science, Watson, a man of method, a man accustomed to consulting charts and tables and arriving at precise conclusions." He returned to the desk. He took from his breast pocket a single sheet of paper and laid it flat upon the chart. Upon it he had drawn 4 concentric circles, each smaller than the last, and in each ring he had written a single line. Outer ring knew the tide schedule. Second ring had access to transport, hand cart. Third ring possessed medical knowledge, the blow. Inner ring had authority to falsify the death certificate. I looked at the 4 rings. I looked at the single empty space at the centre where all 4 converged. "One man, Watson," said Holmes quietly. "Only one man upon this island sits at the centre of all 4 circles." He folded the paper before I could speak. He placed it in his pocket. He gathered up the tide charts, squared them neatly, and returned them to the harbour master's shelf. "Come," he said. "I wish to see the pier once more." We walked it in silence. The morning was cold and bright, the fog of the previous day is entirely gone, the channel lying flat and grey-blue to the horizon. Holmes led me to the north side, where the body had been found, and we descended once more to the lower platform. The tide was out. The pilings stood bare and dark and crusted with barnacles. Holmes pointed. "There, Watson. Do you see, at the place where the body was wedged, The scraping upon the barnacles? I looked. I saw it. A band of fresh scraping, perhaps 18 inches wide, where the sharp edges of the barnacle shells had been broken and flattened. That is not the work of a body washed against the piling by current, Watson. A body moved by current presses, it does not scrape laterally. That is the mark of a body pushed inward, forced between the pilings from the platform side, by a man standing where I am standing now, at low tide, in the dark. He straightened. He looked out across the water. He was silent for perhaps a minute. I have the method, Watson. I have the means. I have the window. I have the motive. 14 estates, embezzled over 11 years, and a forensic accountant who came to the island with the evidence in his satchel. I have the medical knowledge, a single blow to the mastoid, delivered with surgical precision. I have the tide calculation, a 70-minute window exploited to the quarter hour. I have the falsified death certificate, 4 o'clock in the morning, a medical impossibility. I have the lamp burning past 1. I have the sinkers stolen from a shed he passed on his way home from a house call. I have the surgery visited for 3 minutes at 7:15 this morning, when the satchel and the documents were removed from a dead man's room. He turned to me. His face was set. His voice, when he spoke, was very low. Watson, who examined the body first? Who wrote the time of death? Who stood beside us upon this pier and spoke of accidents? Who carried a black bag and a white flower in his lapel and answered every question before it was asked? I did not answer for a long moment. The sea moved beneath us, slow and grey and indifferent. A gull turned upon the wind above the breakwater. "Good God, Holmes," I said at last. "The doctor." "Yes, Watson, the doctor." He said nothing further. We climbed back to the upper boards and walked in silence toward the village. The church clock struck 11. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, in a surgery with a well-thumbed Tide almanac upon its shelf and a brass pestle upon its dispensary counter, Doctor, our Lionel Graves was receiving his morning patients with the composed and gentle manner of a man who had never, in 11 years of island practice, given anyone cause to doubt him. "Holmes," I said, "what do we do now?" "Now, Watson, we do what the evidence demands. We prove it." Chapter 8. The Doctor's Certainty. The second and third telegrams arrived together a few minutes before noon. Holmes read them standing in the doorway of the post office. He read each one twice. He folded them into his breast pocket with great care. Then he turned to me, and upon his face there was an expression I have seen perhaps half a dozen times in our long association. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a kind of grave and settled certainty. The look of a man who has followed a thread through a labyrinth and has arrived at the place where it ends. "Watson," he said, "I have him." The telegrams. The first is from the firm of Marchant and Drew, solicitors of Holborn. They confirm that they engaged Edward Hale to investigate the financial affairs of a physician practising in the Channel Islands on behalf of an elderly creditor, a Mrs. Constance Peveril of Marylebone, who suspected that the executor of her late husband's estate had delayed probate and diverted certain sums. They name the physician. They name him Watson. Graves, Dr. Lionel Graves. The second telegram is from my correspondent in the city, the man who knows where the money goes. He has obtained, through channels I shall not describe, a summary of probate records for Alderney parish over the past 11 years. 14 estates, Watson. 14 patients of Dr. Graves who died, whose deaths he certified, and whose probate he administered or influenced as medical witness. In every case, a delay of between 3 and 9 months between the certificate and the grant. In every case, small sums, never more than £200, never less than 40, redirected during the gap to a private account in St. Helier, Jersey, held in the name of L. Graves. He drew a long breath. 11 years, 14 dead patients. He has been forging death certificates and siphoning from their estates since the year he arrived upon this island. And Edward Hale, forensic accountant, came here with the proof in his satchel and the name of Graves upon his lips. And now Hale is dead, and the satchel is gone, and the proof is ash upon the surgery fireplace, all but one small scrap beneath a dead man's bed, which reads Vess, L. 14 estates. Holmes, we must go to Bramwell. We must go first to the surgery, Watson. Bramwell will arrest upon my word, but a jury will require more than telegrams and a burned fragment. I must have the instrument. I must have the physical proof that ties the doctor to the act. We walked to the surgery at 12:15. Holmes had sent word ahead by Bramwell's constable that he wished to consult with Dr. Graves upon a medical question relating to the case, a pretext so ordinary that no man of Graves' composure could reasonably refuse it. The surgery stood at the upper end of the village road, a square white building with a green door and a brass plate bearing the legend L. Graves, M.D., F.R.C.S. A small dispensary adjoined it at the rear, and beyond this a narrow alley gave onto the lane that led down to the harbour. Graves received us in his consulting room. It was a small, well-ordered chamber, a desk, 2 chairs, a glass-fronted cabinet of instruments, a bookshelf heavy with medical volumes, and upon the desk, among the papers and the prescription blanks, a tied almanac bound in green cloth. I saw it at once. Holmes saw it at once. Neither of us looked at it. "Doctor," said Holmes, seating himself with every appearance of ease, "I come to trouble you with a question of forensic medicine, the matter of post-mortem lividity in cases of immersion. I find myself uncertain upon a point, and your island experience would be invaluable." "Of course, Mr. Holmes. I am happy to assist." They talked. Holmes asked questions, careful, detailed, plausible questions, for the questions of a layman who has read widely but lacks clinical experience. Graves answered with patience and evident pleasure. He was, I realized, a man who enjoyed being consulted, a man who had been, for 11 years, the only authority upon his island, and who took quiet satisfaction in the exercise of that authority even now, even here, even with the rope already being measured for his neck. While they talked, I did as Holmes had instructed me before we arrived. I excused myself to use the lavatory. I was directed through the dispensary, and in the dispensary, a narrow room of shelves and bottles and a long wooden counter, I looked at what Holmes had told me to look for. On a high shelf, among a row of ceramic mortars and glass measures, there stood a brass pestle. It was perhaps 8 inches in length, heavy, with a rounded striking end and a slender handle. It had been cleaned. It was very clean. Cleaner, in fact, than any other instrument upon the shelf, as though it had been scrubbed with particular attention while its neighbours had merely been dusted. But at the base, where the handle met the head, there was a faint discoloration, not the green of aged brass, but the darker, browner stain of something organic that had been incompletely removed. And caught in the seam where the 2 pieces joined, held fast by the tightness of the fitting, there was a single hair, short, ash-coloured, the colour of Edward Hale's hair. I did not touch it. Holmes had told me not to touch it. I looked. I memorized. I returned to the consulting room and took my seat. Holmes was admiring a volume upon the bookshelf. He had risen, as though restless, and was standing with his back to the desk, running one finger along the spines. His left hand hung at his side. I saw, and I am certain Graves did not, that the tied almanac upon the desk was now open. It had been closed when we entered. It was open now, to October, and upon the page for the 14th there was a small pencil mark in the margin beside the entry for low tide. Holmes turned back. He smiled. "You have a most impressive library, Doctor. I envy you the Virchow. And the Casper. Is that the 3rd edition?" "The 2nd, I regret. The 3rd has not yet reached the island." "A pity. It is much improved." Holmes resumed his seat. "Doctor, I have taken enough of your time. You have been most generous. I wonder, might I trouble you for one further kindness? Watson and I have not yet seen the rear of the building. Why, we came in from the front, but I understand the lane behind gives directly onto the harbour road. Might we walk through? It would save us the longer way round." "By all means, through the dispensary and out the back door. The alley is narrow but passable." "You are very kind." We rose. We shook his hand. We passed through the dispensary, where Holmes paused for no more than 3 seconds and looked at the high shelf and at the pestle and at the single ash-coloured hair caught in the seam, and said nothing, and out through the back door into the narrow alley. In the alley against the wall there stood a handcart, a plain wooden handcart of the sort used by tradesmen and delivery boys across every island and village in England. Its wheels were iron-rimmed, its bed was scratched, and upon the left side rail, caught in a splinter of the wood, there was a single dark fibre, wool by its texture, of the same weight and weave as the coat Edward Hale had been wearing when we pulled him from beneath the pier. Holmes crouched beside it. He did not touch the fibre. He looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he rose. "Watson," he said quietly, "go back inside. Ask the doctor whether he has a match. Any pretext. Keep him in the consulting room for 2 minutes." I went. I asked for a match. Graves provided one with a smile. I lit a cigarette I did not want. I remarked upon a diploma on the wall. 2 minutes passed. I thanked the doctor and withdrew. Holmes was waiting for me in the lane. In his hand he held, wrapped in his handkerchief, a small dark object. He opened the handkerchief. Inside, blackened and curled, but not entirely consumed, there lay the corner of a sheet of paper. Upon it, in copperplate printing barely visible beneath the char, I could make out the words, "Marchant and Drew Solicitors, 14 Furnival Street, Holborn. The surgery fireplace, Watson. The flue is narrow and the draught is poor. A man who burns documents in haste does not always burn them completely." He folded the handkerchief with great care and placed it in his breast pocket. The letterhead of the firm that hired Hale, found in the fireplace of the man who killed him. We walked down the lane toward the harbour. The sun was high now, the shadows short, the small grey island laid bare beneath a sky of pale October blue. Holmes walked with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin upon his chest, and for perhaps 100 yards he did not speak. Then he stopped. He turned to me. His face was very still. "Watson, I have the pestle, with the hair. I have the Tide Almanac marked at the page. I have the handcart, with the fibre. I have the letterhead from the fireplace. I have the telegrams, naming the man, the motive, and the 14 estates. I have the false death certificate written in his own hand, stating an hour that is a medical impossibility. And I have the testimony of Mrs. Penrose, who watched his surgery lamp burn past 1 o'clock in the morning upon the night a man was carried to the pier. Then why did we not arrest him, Holmes? Why did we walk out through his back door as though we had come for nothing more than a medical opinion and a cigarette?" Holmes looked at me. His grey eyes were very steady. "Because a man like Graves must be shown his own reflection, Watson. He must see the evidence laid before him, piece by piece, in the presence of those he has deceived, and he must understand that every instrument of his profession, his knowledge, his authority, his trust, has been turned against him and found wanting. Otherwise, he will simply deny it. He will deny it with the same composure with which he certified the death of Edward Hale. He will deny it with the same smile with which he greeted us upon the pier, and some men, perhaps even some upon a jury, will believe him, because they have always believed him, because he is their doctor." He turned and walked on. "Tomorrow morning, Watson, at first light, the tide will be low. It seems fitting." Chapter 9. The Reconstruction. Dawn came grey and cold, with a thin fog lying upon the harbour, and the gulls crying somewhere above it in the unseen sky. The tide was out. The pilings stood bare and dark and wet, and the pier stretched its long wooden spine over the retreating water like a bridge to nowhere. They were all there. Holmes had asked Inspector Bramwell to summon them at first light, under the pretext of a final review of the circumstances of Mr. Hale's death. Bramwell, who by now understood enough to obey without question, had done so with the quiet efficiency of a good soldier carrying out an order he does not fully comprehend. And so they stood upon the upper boards of the pier in the grey October morning, Dr. Lionel Graves, with his black coat and his black bag, and his hands folded before him, Captain Moore, weathered and watchful, standing apart with his back against a bollard, Clara Whitby, in her grey woollen dress, her face very pale, Arthur Bell, wringing his cap between his hands as he had done upon the morning of the discovery, and Bramwell himself, straight-backed and grave beside the ladder that led down to the lower platform. Holmes stood at the seaward end, facing them. He had not slept. I could see it in the hollows beneath his eyes and in the particular drawn quality of his face, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady and very clear, and it carried across the boards of the pier as though the fog itself had drawn back to hear him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for coming. I shall not keep you long. What I have to say concerns the death of Edward Hale, and it will be said once completely and without interruption. When I have finished, those who wish to speak may do so." No one moved, no one spoke. The gulls cried above the fog. Edward Hale arrived upon this island 2 days ago on the 2:15 ferry from Weymouth. He was not a tourist. He was not a lover returned to claim an old affection, though he attempted that as well. He was a forensic accountant, a man hired by a firm of London solicitors to investigate the financial affairs of a physician practising upon this island. He came with evidence in his satchel and a name upon his lips. He came to confront a man who had been embezzling from the estates of his deceased patients for 11 years. Clara Whitby's hand rose to her throat. Moore's eyes narrowed. Bell stood very still. Graves did not move. At 4:30 on the afternoon of his arrival, Hale visited Miss Whitby at her cottage. He asked for her help. She refused. He left her a poem, which she later burned. This visit has no bearing upon his death, and I mention it only to clear the air of a suspicion which has attached itself, unfairly, to an innocent woman. Clara looked at the boards beneath her feet. She did not lift her head. At 8 o'clock that evening, Hale left the Seagull Inn carrying a leather satchel. He walked to the surgery of Dr. Lionel Graves. He had sent word ahead, requesting a private consultation. He arrived at 9:15. What followed was not a consultation. It was a confrontation. Hale laid before the doctor the evidence of 14 estates, 14 patients whose deaths Graves had certified, whose probate he had delayed, and from whose funds he had diverted small but consistent sums to a private account in Jersey over the course of 11 years. I watched Graves. His face had not changed. His hands remained folded. His eyes were upon Holmes with the same mild, composed attention with which he had received us upon this same pier 2 mornings ago. Hale demanded £3,000 for his silence. Graves refused. At 22 minutes past 9, the hour recorded by the dead man's pocket watch stopped by the force of his fall, Graves struck Edward Hale once at the base of the skull, behind the right ear, at the mastoid process, with a brass pestle taken from the dispensary shelf. The blow was surgically precise. It was the blow of a man who knew exactly where to strike and exactly what would follow. Death was near instantaneous. The fog shifted. A gull passed low over the pier, its wings white against the grey. Graves spent the next 4 hours in his surgery. He burned the documents Hale had brought. He burned the satchel. He cleaned the pestle and returned it to the shelf. He consulted his tide almanac, the same almanac I found open upon his desk, marked in pencil at the entry for low tide on the 14th of October, and he waited. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, when the tide had fallen sufficiently to expose the lower platform of this pier, Graves loaded the body into a handcart, the same handcart that stands now in the alley behind his surgery, with a fibre of Mr. Hale's coat still caught upon the rail. He wheeled it through the fog, the same fog that Mrs. Penrose, from her window at the lighthouse, I observed still hanging upon the harbour. At the hour she noted the doctor's surgery lamp burning past 1 o'clock. He weighted the coat pockets with lead sinkers he had stolen from Mr. Bell's shed 4 nights earlier, during a house call to treat Mrs. Bell's influenza. a call which gave him occasion to pass within 6 paces of an unbolted shed on his way out. A small theft, barely noticeable, but sufficient to ensure that, should the body be examined, suspicion would fall upon a dock worker and a petty thief, and not upon the island's most respected gentleman. Bell let out a small sound, a half-breath, something between relief and outrage. Holmes continued without pause. He wedged the body between the north pilings at a height of 4 feet and 2 inches, a height calculated, with the precision of a man who has studied the tides of this harbour for over a decade, to be submerged at high water and revealed at low. By dawn, the retreating tide would expose the body. It would appear to have been washed against the pier during the night. An accident. A sad, simple, entirely plausible accident. Holmes paused. He drew a single breath. And at 6:30 the following morning, this morning, the man who had committed the murder was summoned, in his professional capacity, to examine the body. He knelt beside his own victim. He placed his hand upon the wrist whose pulse he had extinguished 7 hours before. He pronounced the cause of death, and he signed in his own hand, with the same pen whose ink still stained his thumb, a death certificate stating the time of death as approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. He turned to Graves. "That certificate, Doctor, is a lie. Rigor mortis at the hour of discovery was already far too advanced for a death 3 hours prior. The lungs contained no water. The salt crystallization upon the skin was consistent with 3 to 4 hours of immersion, not 8. The inner pockets of the coat were dry. Every observable fact of the body contradicts the hour you wrote upon your certificate. You did not make an error, Doctor. You wrote a falsehood, and you wrote it because you are the only man upon this island with the authority to write it and the knowledge to make it plausible." Holmes reached into his breast pocket. He produced, one by one, the items he had gathered. The pestle, wrapped in cloth, with the single ash-coloured hair caught in the seam. The charred corner of the Marchant and Drew letterhead, recovered from the surgery fireplace. The tied almanac page marked in pencil, the telegram from London naming 14 estates and 11 years of fraud. He laid them upon the rail of the pier in a row like exhibits before a magistrate. The fog was thinning now. The pale sun was beginning to show through. "You are a methodical man, Doctor," said Holmes. "It was your methodicalness that condemned you. A less careful man would have struck wildly and left traces everywhere. You struck once precisely and cleaned everything, almost everything. A less learned man would have dumped the body from the pier and trusted to luck. You consulted your almanac and calculated to the quarter hour. A less authoritative man would have had no power to certify the death he had caused. You had every power, every advantage. Every tool of your profession became an instrument of your crime, and every instrument in the end has testified against you." Graves had not moved throughout. His hands remained folded before him. His face had not changed. The silver hair was neat. The black coat was buttoned. He stood as he had stood since the beginning, composed, contained, the very picture of the man the island had trusted for 11 years. He spoke at last, quietly, without raising his voice. "I should like to see your evidence, Mr. Holmes." "It is before you, Doctor." Graves looked at the pestle. He looked at the letterhead. He looked at the almanac page and at the telegram. He looked at them for a long time. Then he closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. Not in his face. His face was as composed as ever. But in the eyes themselves, in the quality of the light behind them, there was a stillness that had not been there before. The stillness of a man who has been running and has stopped. "He would have ruined me, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. "He would have taken everything." "He was going to take your money, Doctor," said Holmes. "You took his life." The fog parted. The sun fell pale and cold upon the pier, and upon the faces of those gathered there, and upon the evidence laid out upon the rail, and upon the grey, indifferent sea that moved beneath them all. Chapter 10. The Truth Beneath the Surface. For a long moment no one moved. The evidence lay upon the rail. The fog was lifting. The pale sun fell upon the faces of those gathered upon the pier, and upon the grey water beneath, and upon the still, composed figure of Dr. Lionel Graves, who stood with his eyes closed and his hands folded before him, as though he were praying, or remembering, or saying goodbye. Then he opened his eyes. "Inspector," he said. His voice was quiet, perfectly steady. "I should like to fetch my coat from the surgery before I am taken to the mainland. The crossing will be cold." Bramwell hesitated. He looked at Holmes. Holmes, after a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, inclined his head. "Constable Ridley will accompany you, Doctor," said Bramwell. "Of course." Graves turned. When he walked back along the pier toward the harbour road with the same unhurried step with which he had walked toward us 2 mornings ago. The step of a man who has been called and knows that he will be welcomed. Constable Ridley, a broad young man of perhaps 25, fell in beside him at a respectful distance. The others watched them go. Clara Whitby turned her face away. Moore lit his pipe. Bell stood wringing his cap. They had gone perhaps 40 yards when it happened. At the junction of the pier and the harbour road, where the stone slipway descends to the water and the smaller boats are moored at their chains, Graves stopped. He turned to Ridley and said something, a word, perhaps 2, and in the instant that Ridley's attention shifted, Graves moved. He did not run. That was the remarkable thing. He walked, quickly, purposefully, but without panic, down the slipway and onto the narrow stone causeway that led to the inner moorings. A small sailboat was tied there, white-hulled, with a single mast and a furled canvas. His own boat. I learned later that he had kept it for 11 years, and that he sailed it on fine Sundays to the neighbouring islands, and that no one upon Alderney thought anything of it, because it was the doctor's boat, and the doctor was a man who could be trusted with anything. "Stop him!" Bramwell shouted. Holmes was already moving. I was a step behind him. Ridley, to his credit, recovered almost at once and broke into a run. But Graves had reached the boat. His hands, the hands of a man who had done this 1,000 times, found the mooring line and cast it off in a single motion. He stepped aboard. He pushed off from the causeway with one foot. The boat drifted clear of the stone. We reached the causeway as the gap of dark water opened between the hull and the landing. 2 feet, 3. Holmes stopped at the edge. He did not attempt to jump. He stood and watched. The boat drifted out into the harbour. Graves moved to the mast. He began to unfurl the canvas. His movements were calm and precise, the movements of a man who has rehearsed this also, who has always known that it might come to this, and who has planned for it with the same methodical care with which he had planned everything else. But the tide was wrong. I understood it before Graves did, or perhaps I understood it at the same moment, watching from the causeway as the small white boat swung slowly, helplessly, in the shallow water of the retreating harbour. The tide was at its lowest ebb. The channel between the inner moorings and the open sea was no more than 3 feet deep and falling. The keel of the sailboat, drawing, as I later learned, nearly 4 feet, struck the harbour bottom with a soft, grinding shudder, and the boat came to rest, canted slightly to port, perhaps 60 yards from the causeway and 100 from the open water. The canvas hung slack. There was no wind to fill it. The boat turned slowly in the grey water, pushed by the last feeble current of the draining tide, and came to rest against the outer face of the harbour wall, where the barnacles grew thick and the pilings stood dark and wet in the morning light. Graves stood upon the deck. He did not try to push off. He did not try to swim. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he looked back at the pier, at Holmes, at Bramwell, at Clara, at Bell, at Moore, at the evidence still lying upon the rail, and his face, for the first time since I had known him, was entirely without expression, not composed, not controlled, simply empty, the face of a man who has exhausted every calculation and arrived at the one outcome he had not foreseen. He looked, I wrote in my notebook that evening, like a man who had always known how this would end. Only the date surprised him. Bramwell sent Ridley in a rowing boat. Graves did not resist. He stepped from the sailboat into the skiff as he might have stepped from a carriage, and he sat upon the thwart with his hands upon his knees, and he did not speak as they rowed him back to the causeway. He did not speak as Bramwell placed the irons upon his wrists. He did not speak as they led him up the harbour road toward the parish jail, where he would wait for the mainland ferry and the long journey to London, and to the trial that would follow. He spoke only once, as he passed the surgery, his surgery, with its green door and its brass plate and its dispensary, where the pestle still stood upon its shelf. He slowed, and he turned his head, and he said to no one in particular, "The garden will need watering." And then he walked on, and the green door receded behind him, and I did not see Dr. Lionel Graves again. His confession came within the week. It was full. It was detailed. It was delivered with the same composure with which he had certified the death of Edward Hale. 11 years of forgeries, 14 estates, the blackmail, the murder. He omitted nothing. He explained everything. He was, to the very last, a methodical man. Holmes and I stood upon the pier on the morning of our departure. The ferry was making steam in the harbour. Our bags were aboard. The fog had returned, thinner than before, but present, as though the island could not quite bring itself to let us leave in sunlight. Holmes stood at the rail and looked down at the water. "The sea is an honest witness, Watson," he said. "It keeps nothing, and reveals all." Our Dr. Graves forgot that a tide which conceals in the night must always uncover in the morning. He trusted the water to lie for him. But water, like truth, obeys only its own laws. He was silent for a moment. He was not a wicked man, Watson, not in the way that Moriarty is wicked, or Colonel Moran, or any of the great criminals whose shadows I have spent my life pursuing. He was a frightened man, a man who had made a single dishonest choice 11 years ago, and had been running from its consequences ever since. When Hale arrived upon this island with the evidence in his satchel, Graves saw not a man, but an ending. And he chose, as frightened men sometimes do, the ending that he could control. It does not excuse the murder, Holmes. Nothing excuses it, but I find I can understand it, and I find that understanding brings me no pleasure at all. He turned from the rail. The ferry whistle sounded. The mooring lines were cast off, and the deck trembled beneath our feet, and Alderney began, very slowly, to fall away behind us. I watched it go. The harbour shrank. The pier diminished to a thin, dark line. The lighthouse on the eastern point grew small. The cottages upon the hill dissolved into the grey, and the cliffs faded, and the sea closed around us, and at last there was nothing but the fog and the water, and the slow, patient rhythm of the Channel swell. Somewhere beneath those grey waves, the pilings of the pier stood bare at the turning of the tide, as they had stood on the morning Arthur Bell found the body of Edward Hale wedged between them. The barnacles would grow over the scrapes. The salt would wash the stains from the stone. The island would close around the memory of its doctor, as the sea closes around a stone dropped from a height. A ripple, a disturbance, and then the surface, smooth and grey and indifferent, as though nothing had ever broken it at all. I turned from the rail. Holmes was seated upon a coil of rope at the stern, his pipe between his teeth, his eyes half closed against the wind, and he appeared to be asleep. He was not asleep. He was, I knew, already thinking of something else. The next case, the next telegram, the next impossible thing that would require him to see what others could not. I took out my notebook. I opened it to the first blank page, and I began to write. The sea reveals what men try to hide, and on that October morning it revealed a man who had forgotten he was one of them.